Rebel, written by Allan Baillie and illustrated by Dai Wu.
The general came across the dusty plain of Burma in the early morning. He came with great clanking tanks and wheeled guns and creaking lorries, and long columns of crunching, hard-faced soldiers. They marched over the bridge, past the ancient pagoda and the quiet shops, until they stopped outside the open playground of the school. The general patted his hand with his baton and looked at the school, and the children inside the school looked at the general. The general pointed his baton and the tanks rolled over the school's fence. The children watched the tanks flatten the slides, the swings, and the monkey bars. Nobody spoke.
The hard-faced soldiers spread through the town, kicking down doors and bringing every person in the town before the general. The general climbed onto a tank. He stroked his baton, nodded so the gold stars on his hat flashed in the sun, rolled his shoulders so the rows of medals clinked proudly on his chest. He looked down at the townspeople and smiled at them. They looked back at him, and nobody smiled. He said, "You are my people now. I have the tanks and the soldiers, and you have nothing. I make all the laws, punish who I wish, tell you when to plant the rice and when to harvest it." Nobody spoke. "You give me half of everything you make, and at school the children learn only of my heroic battles and of my glorious victories." At that moment, a small, battered thong was flung from the school building. It whirled past 3 wide-eyed washerwomen, flipped over a frightened fireman, skimmed over a sleepy sergeant, and hit the general behind the ear. The general's hat dipped onto his nose, bounced on the cannon of the tank, and flopped into the dust. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Everybody waited through a long and terrible silence. The general stared down at his hat, upside down in the dust, with the thong propped against it. He began to hiss like a boiling kettle. "What?" he roared, and struck his leg hard with the baton. He turned slowly to the school, his medals clinking, his moustache twitching. The sergeant darted forward, picking up the general's hat and the thong. "Who did that?" bellowed the general at the school. There was no sound, no movement from the school. The sergeant furiously dusted the general's hat and polished the stars. The general snatched his hat from the sergeant and rammed it on his head. "I will get the little bandit who attacked me and put him in a parrot's cage and feed him on pig's swill, and—" The general saw the thong in the sergeant's hand and plucked it away with his baton. "Aha!" he said, and showed his teeth. "Bring all the children out from the school. Find the child wearing only one thong and drag him to me." The soldiers crunched into the school and they marched the children before the general. They stood straight as posts, the children and their teachers, and looked straight past the general. The general looked at the children and glared. The hard-faced soldiers looked at the children and they began to cough. Their hard faces began to twitch. The townspeople looked at the children and smiled and grinned, and someone somewhere began to giggle. The general stood on his tank, tinkled his medals, shone his stars, and broke his baton. For in that school there was a large pile of thongs, and all the children and all the teachers had nothing at all on their feet. The general went past the noisy shops, past the ancient pagoda and over the bridge. He went with great clanking tanks and wheeled guns and creaking lorries and long columns of crunching, grinning soldiers. The general marched across the dusty plain of Burma in the late afternoon. But he could still hear the laughter.
The heart of this story is true. It happened in 1990 at a school in Rangoon,